Today I'm hosting a conversation about the war in Israel with former member of the Israeli parliament, Einat Wilf, and political commentator and popular live streamer Destiny. Destiny, so I'm going to start with you. It's a simple question, but what do you think is Israel's goals with this war?
Probably twofold. I think the primary goal is the elimination of Hamas in the Gaza Strip to bring some kind of stability to it. And then the second one is probably the release of the hostages.
So in terms of getting rid of Hamas, what's the goal beyond that? Is it towards peace, or is it just to get rid of Hamas, or security? Or what is it?
I mean, probably to get rid of Hamas and then have some sort of stable, rulable, controllable Gaza Strip where there's some level of security for Israel. I mean, I would imagine. I don't think you want to just remove Hamas and then just leave a giant vacuum and then have it completely go to hell after the war is over.
So what I'm just trying to work out is this like going to be are they trying to do this in the faith of, let's say, trying to get to peace, or trying to do some sort of solution? Because as far as you're saying, it doesn't really sound like it.
I don't like the word peace. I think peace is a really dumb word that people use to describe a lot of things. I think peace is really easy to achieve in a lot of different ways. If you completely nuke and destroy like every single person on the planet, you have world peace because nobody's fighting. If everybody there's ways to get to peace that don't really solve anything. I think what people are really looking for in conflicts is justice, right? You want like a solution that leaves both sides feeling like they've got what they want out of a particular thing. For this particular conflict between Israel and Palestine, obviously there are things that both sides want that they would consider like a just resolution. Trying to find like a peaceful end where people just aren't fighting just kicks the can down the road until you run into future conflicts. So I don't know right now if there's any plans for lasting peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, because I don't even know if both sides know what that looks like right now. I think right now people are trying to bring the current conflict to an end, the current war.
Einat, what about you? What do you think is the aim of this war?
So I'm an Israeli, and I'm not really an outside commentator. I think Destiny described, I think it's fairly correct to describe that these are the declared aims of the war. I, of course, am just deeply critical that those are the aims. So
why? What do you want?
It's a good description of what the goals are.
What do you want the aims to be instead?
So I think we made the mistake of actually limiting the goals and making them very small. And I want to argue, perhaps counterintuitively, that by limiting the goals, we made it almost impossible to win the war. And I think we should have actually placed the goals much, much higher. What are the limited goals? The limited goals, as Destiny described, are to basically remove Hamas from power, of course, bring back the hostages. But in doing so, I compared it to America in December of 1941 declaring war against the kamikazes, as if they were the problem. And by focusing on Hamas, we've actually allowed it to we allowed a lie to be propagated as if Hamas is some independent entity that has nothing to do with the Palestinian ethos, that has nothing to do with the Palestinian vision of no Jewish state, as if it hijacked a people, as if it committed October 7th without any connection to the fundamental ethos of the people. And I think we should have gone exactly in the opposite direction. I think we should have established a very high goal that says that the goal of the war, given how brutal the October 7th massacre was, is to finally put an end to the century-long war that the Palestinians specifically, but the Arab world more largely, have waged against Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. And that therefore this is both a diplomatic war and it is about ending the war against Jewish sovereignty rather than a limited war against the current, those who are currently acting on behalf of the Palestinian vision of no Jewish state.
So I mean, what you said, you want something broader can actually do something to stop instead of Hamas, which is just could be something temporary. So, what are you suggesting? Something like attacking Iran and making sure that they don't have a nuclear deterrent, and maybe even going further with them?
Oh, Iran is above our pay grade. I mean, if you look at the century long, when I'm trying to see the reason that I have my moments of deep dread is if you look at the last century of who the supporters of Palestinianism were, I mean, I think we can be fairly certain that no one in the world would have cared about several hundreds of thousands of Arabs, now several millions living in the Levant, if they had not waged a total war against Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. As a result, they always had supporters who were the most anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish powers of the moment. So in the 30s and 40s, they had a fruitful collaboration with the Nazis. The implications of it, some persist to this day. When the Nazis were defeated, they were replaced by the Pan-Arabists that turned Palestinianism into the secular theology. It was the only thing that united the Arabs. When the Pan-Arabists were defeated, the Soviet Union stepped into the breach to really take Palestinianism global, to take anti-Zionism global behind the mask of Palestinianism. And when the Soviet Union was defeated, ultimately Iran stepped into the breach, and now it is the main anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist backer of Palestinianism, using it for its geopolitics. Now, the good news in all of this is that I have no doubt that the Mullah and Ayatollah regime in Iran will find the same fate as its predecessor supporters of Palestinianism, the Nazis, the Pan-Arabists, and the Soviets. But this is above our pay grade. We did not defeat the Soviet Union. We did not defeat the Nazis. And when I say that I have great moments of dread, is that although the good news is that there's no doubt that ultimately the Mullah and Ayatollah regime will find itself in the same dustbin of history as the Nazis, the Pan-Arabists, and the Soviets, on the way to the dustbin of history, those entities caused a lot of damage to the Jews and some global mayhem. So for me, the question is, how much more damage will they cause before they are defeated? But we alone cannot defeat Iran.
So who are you looking to do that? Are you looking for America, the UK, or Israel's allies?
So recently I was in a briefing by a senior American official, and I came out of that briefing feeling like Czechoslovakia. And I want to write a piece where I want to say, we are Jews, we are Czechoslovakia, we are the British. We are Jews, clearly, that is some of the global insanity we're seeing, and that's the danger I fear. We are Czechoslovakia in the sense that the power, the United States, that ultimately needs to have the will, is right now is in a very appeasement mode. Someone correctly noted that the new word for appeasement is de-escalation. People forget that appeasement was actually a good word in the 30s until it became discredited. And now de-escalation is the word. Who can be against de-escalation? But it actually extends war. And I feel right now, so we're also Czechoslovakia in the sense that America seems very much willing to kind of try to reach all kinds of arrangements, peace in our time, let the Nazis have the Sudetenland. And ultimately, we're also Britain. We are fighting it alone until more people get it. And like Churchill said, Britain will fight until the might of the new world will come to the aid of the old. But right now, unfortunately, I'm not yet seeing that kind of leadership and determination.
So just to put that together, you're saying that the West should lead that against Iran, or what's...
Yeah. Of course, ultimately, it's, again, we can't do this alone, with all due respect.
Destiny, do you agree?
Yeah, that Israel can't go and blow up Iran all on their own. Yeah, of course. I mean,
no, in terms of like the West need to lead that against Iran.
Kind of. One of the things that makes Israel-Palestine so complicated is even the terminology. Like, is it Israel-Palestine, or is it Israel versus the Arab world, or is it Israel versus the Muslim world? There's like conflicts within conflicts that are occurring in parallel, and sometimes extricating, one of those conflicts from the other one, and then seeing what's going on, gives you a different view of of a wider conflict. So, for instance, when we talk about the United States needing to take leadership on dealing with Iran, that's something that I think is obviously agreeable. Obviously, Iran has major international backers like Russia. So Israel dealing with just an Iranian proxy isn't going to do anything to Iran proper, and that requires like a full coalition of other countries coming together through sanctions and other types of soft and diplomatic pressures to make Iran do things. However, I think one of the major issues that Israel is facing is, I think in the 70s, I think Israel thought that they could kind of like push the Palestinians aside and figure out how to deal with everybody besides them. It started with Egypt, and then it became Jordan, and then you've got the Abraham Accords. And I think that in the beginning, I was sympathetic, or I shouldn't say I was sympathetic because I wasn't alive, but I'm sympathetic towards how that view worked in the beginning. But I think that right now, that problem of figuring out what the final arrangement for Palestine looks like, that I think is a uniquely Israeli problem. And I think that Israel, it's within their power to deal with that. I think they have to deal with that. They have to figure that out, because that it's just a wedge that everybody around the world to some extent can exploit. Whether it's Western activists on campuses, whether it's Iran looking to ship weapons, or to train fighters through Hamas. That's a problem that I think uniquely Israel is probably going to have to deal with. I don't know if there's going to be another Jimmy Carter, that's willing to take the reins so much on an issue like that and try to lead to some kind of actual arrangement of like final peace and security between Israelis and Palestinians.
Are you saying that if Israel sorts out the issue, then Iran won't be such enemies? Or are you saying that Iran right now aren't such enemies?
I'm saying that if that issue gets sorted out, a whole bunch of stuff in the Middle East can fall in line much simpler. That if Palestinians were in a secure state where somebody like Hamas, doesn't come to power and doesn't commit terrorist attacks, isn't able to be funded by, Iran, it sets the whole Middle East in a certain direction to where things like Hezbollah and maybe even the Houthis and Iran proper can be focused on without this weird thing where you've got this, this kind of like Saudi axis against this Iranian axis, but also everybody's looking at Israel and they're like, why haven't you figured out the Palestinian stuff yet? Because even on the Saudi side, it stirs up a lot of resentment between all of the individual members of the nations that would otherwise probably find themselves in agreement with most of Israeli foreign policy today.
So if Israel do get that sorted out with the Gaza or with Palestine, do you think that will, like, Iran won't like support a terror organization as Hezbollah or other organizations to do stuff to Israel?
No, I mean, they definitely would, but it'd be much easier to focus on that. And you'd have more, I think, unity in protecting Israel or in helping Israel with their security situation if the Palestinian issue was not an issue anymore.
Okay. Einat, I mean, it seems like you said that you think the war should be bigger and focusing on bigger things rather than just Hamas and creating that like Destiny said, maybe not peace, but arrangement, which seems quite different to what Destiny said, which is the opposite, almost the opposite way around to what you said.
So I actually discussed those two things in tandem. We are, of course, stuck in a situation that the reason that the Palestinian issue has not been resolved for over a century is the combination really of the local and the geopolitical. Because on the local element, from the beginning, the Arabs of the land, later to be known as Palestinians, waged a complete and total war against Jewish sovereignty. There's actually not a moment in the last century where you can find that there was a Palestinian vision of peace where anywhere there was a Jewish state. And that is mostly manifested through their insistence on this non-existence right of return, the perpetual refugeehood. Destiny mentioned, for example, the word justice, which is very important because while we think of justice as just, people getting something that is sufficient or legitimate, in the Arab and Palestinian tracking of that word, and you can go back decades, and this is, by the way, why the organizations on campus are called Students for Justice in Palestine, is in their view, justice is only one. Justice is the undoing of the injustice, which is the existence of Jewish sovereignty, which is why, when I give my talks on what is the conflict, what it's about, what has and how to solve it, I always use this quote by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. And the reason this quote is so valuable is that it's because it's from February 47, before Israel exists, before war, before refugees, before settlements, before military occupation. And he says that His Majesty's government has come to the conclusion that the conflict in the land is irreconcilable. He calls it irreconcilable in February 47, before all these things that we today think of as the causes of the conflict. And then he says the reason that the conflict is irreconcilable is because in the land there are two groups, Jews and Arabs, so there's no question that those are two collectives. And he says in each one of those has a top priority. He says for the Jews, the top priority is to establish a Jewish sovereignty. So the Jews want a state based on the universal principle of self-determination for their people in their homeland. And he says for the Arabs, the top priority is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. And thereby he captured the unchanging essence of the conflict before and since, that the Jews want a state and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. By the way, this is not a moral statement. This is a descriptive one. A lot of people think that resisting Jewish statehood is entirely legitimate, but it doesn't change the fact that this is at the core of the conflict. So because the Arabs were waging a total war from fairly the beginning, no Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land, no sovereign Jews anywhere, that's what made them valuable for every anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist power in the last century. So it's very difficult to extricate the two, because what gives fuel to the continuing war of the Palestinians against Jewish sovereignty is the fact that they can always rely on every anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist power of the moment. So in order to resolve the Palestinian issue, which I very much favor, we first need to make sure that Palestinians finally develop a different vision, not the one that resists to the last Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land, but rather one that wants to live next to the Jewish state rather than instead of it, with all the implications, meaning that they're not refugees. There's no such thing as refugee return into the sovereign state of Israel. Once that becomes the Palestinian vision, we can very easily reach a solution based on two states. The problem is, how do we reach a kind of Palestinian identity that wants to live next to the Jewish state rather than instead of it, when it is constantly being fueled by every anti-Semitic power in history? And extricating that is the biggest challenge we face. I have some ideas, but this is precisely the challenge.
So Destiny, just moving on. So what would you say is the best, I would say solution, but you'd say arrangement to a long-term quote unquote peace?
Yeah, let me just, I don't know. I mean, I feel like if I had the answer to that, yeah, that's the $1 trillion question, huh? Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the more I learn, the more there's always like a thing relying on another thing, or a thing that prevents another thing from happening. I feel like, broadly speaking, as much as it seems to irritate both sides, I think that Israel needs to be a powerful partner to the Palestinian Authority. Now, I know this is irritating because for a variety of reasons, a lot of Israelis don't like the Palestinian Authority, and we can very plainly and clearly see from polling data that a lot of Palestinians don't like the Palestinian Authority. But I think that Israel needs to empower somebody that they can work with to reach some kind of, arrangement for, ideally the two states, I guess, right? I don't see any other way out of it. The fact that I think that Mahmoud Abbas is not a perfect person, but when you look at the condition of the Palestinians living in Israel, Palestinians living in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, these are people that are meaningfully different than they were, from 2000 to 2005. They're meaningfully different than they were from the early days of the PLO, from the early wars. inside Israel proper, you've got a huge Arab population, a huge Palestinian population that is largely a peaceful population. They're not, doing constant terror attacks. They're, you haven't had your third, fourth, and fifth intifada. They didn't join in a mass uprising of violence against, the state of Israel on October 7th. And I think that's worth saying something. And if you look at the presence of the Palestinian Authority through a lot of West Bank cities, you've got like some sense of security. You've got, cities that are functioning despite everything else affecting them, despite whether or not they might have as much access to water as they'd like, despite if they've had as much access to freedom of movement as they'd like. I think that this is a direction that is hard to see the positives of it, obviously, because every time there's attacks, every time there's a border riot, every time there's some kind of conflict, that's what the news goes to and that's what people focus on. But prior to October 7th, I think you were hitting like really positive levels of integration between Palestinian people and between Israeli people. I think it's really sad and tragic that after the 7th, so many, you've got the freezing of all the permits from workers in the West Bank. In my opinion, that's a catastrophe. You are basically segregating the people more. You're depriving them of job opportunities and money. You're driving them deeper into, kind of like this existential hole where these young people have no hope and they don't see any future in this conflict. They just see Jewish people or Israelis as enemies. And in Israel proper, you've got a lot of, for understandable reasons, Jewish people that don't want to buy or order goods or services from, their Palestinian or Arab workers anymore, which again, I think is just driving people apart. So I guess, everybody's got a different goal or path towards a solution, but I think that if it seems impossible to find a solution right now, it's probably because the conditions aren't right for it. So the focus should be on creating the conditions for peace. And I think that part of those conditions are, one is empowering a strong partner to work with, like Abbas, who again, for all of his issues, Abu Mazen is way better to work with than Arafat. I think it's undeniable. It's an improvement. So it's empowering somebody else to work with. And then the second part is just increasing the integration between the two different peoples, that are largely in conflict in this region.
How would you trust Israel? Not how would you trust Israel. How would Israel trust those people to come into their borders after October 7th? How would they trust Palestinians?
Again, I think it says something that after October 7th, you didn't have your massive third intifada from Palestinians living in Israel, from Palestinians living in the West Bank. I think that's really important. I think that says a lot about the progress that population has made inside of Israel. Like these are, from an American Western perspective, we always talk about, how scary, Arabs are, how scary Muslims are. But you have a population that is primed to do terror and attack more than any other Muslim population, probably in all of human history, right? You've got Muslims and Jews. You've got, an occupied people and occupiers. You've got a history of violence and bloodshed. And they have the opportunity, because they live in the country. They're actually citizens of this country. 20% of Israel is made up of these Palestinian Arabs. But they didn't. And I think that's really important. I think that's incredibly meaningful. And I think that should be, focused on. When I was in Israel, I talked to all these people that prior to 2005, prior to 2000, these people went to the Gaza Strip. They went to the beaches. They, went to visit friends there. They bought things from Palestinians there in markets. These are two people that can and have like worked together and shopped together and participated in culture together. I see Jewish people that go to the markets in Kfar Qasim on Shabbat and they go shop there. Like it's not like an intractable problem on a personal level. So I think that I understand the fear, but I think it's important to understand that, like, when people get scared, they oftentimes make stupid decisions. As an American, I think nobody knows this better in the past 2.5 decades than we do, because we're traumatized by our horrible adventures in the Middle East after 9/11. So I hope that, I hope that people don't make decisions only rooted in fear and look a little bit more, trust like the intelligence agencies. I think Shin Bet came out and said that there isn't any evidence that people with work permits, even from the Gaza Strip, were involved in planning or plotting any of the actual attacks on October 7th. So, that'd be what I say.
Einat, you're shaking your head a bit there. What's your thoughts?
Definitely I support the idea that we need to create the conditions of peace. This is precisely what I work for. It's why I call myself a long-term peace activist. But what does it mean to create the conditions for peace? We know, for example, that better living conditions, better economy never created the conditions for peace. The Human Development Index of Gaza on the eve of October 7th was better than half of the countries in the world. We know that on the eve of the murderous rampage, misnamed the Second Intifada, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza enjoyed a high level of economic prosperity. So we actually know empirically that there's no relation between economic conditions and waging the war against Jewish sovereignty. The only difference is the ideology. And in this thing, there's actually no meaningful change between today and 2005 and 1970, 1947, and 1937. In all of this, to the credit of the Arabs and the Palestinians, they have been remarkably consistent in making it clear that their top priority is no Jewish state in any borders whatsoever, anywhere between the river and the sea. And in that sense, even though someone like Abbas reached the conclusion after the rampage and massacres of the Second Intifada that it's better to pursue the Palestinian goal of no Jewish state by other means, he did not at any point actually challenge the goal. So there is no Palestinian leader, and for that matter, nobody of note. I have over 20 years only met 3 Palestinians who publicly and openly acknowledge the equal right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their historic homeland, who want to live in a Palestinian state next to a Jewish state rather than instead of it, with the implication that they understand that they are not refugees and they possess no right of return into the sovereign state of Israel. So in that sense, there's no change. So I think the only path to peace is to actually finally transform this ideology, because that is at the core of all the wars, of all the terrorist organizations. They may be called Hamas or Jihad or Black September or PLO, but they all share the same vision of no Jewish state. So I very much share Destiny's idea of empowering those with whom we can work, and I will argue disempowering those with whom we cannot. What does it mean? It means that I think Israel, morning, afternoon, and night, we need to say that 3 times a day, because unfortunately the international community has the memory of a goldfish. We need to say morning, afternoon, and night that the day that the Palestinians end their century-long war against Jewish sovereignty, with all the implications, the day that they develop a vision of living next to the Jewish state rather than instead of it, that they acknowledge that they're not refugees and there's no return into the sovereign state of Israel, they are guaranteed to meet a state of Israel and its citizens who will make peace and divide the land with them, but not a minute before. And then work to empower the 3 Palestinian voices and hopefully more who agree to that, and begin to disempower, which means remove the fuel that allows all the others to continue with their ideology of no Jewish state. And that is the path to peace that I think will ultimately get us to the point where we can live side by side in prosperity.
But how do we get rid of those people that are saying that there shouldn't be a Jewish state? And also, by the way, do you think that there shouldn't be, do you think it's the whole Arab world, or it's just the Palestinians that think there shouldn't be a Jewish state?
You don't get rid of people.
Get rid of the ideology. The ideology.
Yeah. Exactly. That's why the parallels are to Nazi Germany or to Imperial Japan, where there was a positive radical vision for the transformation of those societies away from the destructive ideology that both brought ruin to them and for much of the world. So the idea is to create that transformation. The transformation basically includes exactly what Destiny said, empowering those who have that vision, even if they are 3 people. You know, in one of my talks, when I said, look, I've only ever, and I've been on this journey for 20 years. It's not that I sit at home. I actively seek out Palestinian voices. Everyone that tells me that I'm exaggerating, I always challenge them. I tell them, by all means, prove me wrong. And don't bring me the same 3 people that I already know. So when I tell that, and I said, look, those are the people who need to be empowered. Whatever money flows needs to flow to those people. And someone said, but it's only 3 people. I said, fine, they should get the billions. Have them live in castles. Make it clear that we want to empower that vision rather than the vision that has dominated Arab Palestinian society for the last century. Now, you spoke more broadly. Within Palestinian society, as I said, there's basically almost no dissenting voices. There are a few courageous ones. But in the Arab world, and that's where it gets interesting and hopeful, is you have the beginning of some Arab countries, especially in the Gulf, that are finally letting go of anti-Zionism as a marker of an Arab and Muslim identity. And it's not a coincidence that the more successful Arab countries, such as the UAE, perhaps increasingly Saudi, the ones that have a vision for themselves and their people that is modern, forward-looking, tolerant, they no longer have a need for anti-Zionism, because anti-Zionism, like anti-Semitism, is the mark of failed societies, because it's a scapegoating mechanism. And you only need scapegoating when societies are in crisis, when they're failed. The scapegoating of Zionism has been a key crutch of failed Arab regimes. So it's not a coincidence that Arab governments that no longer need to explain to a kind of scapegoat from their failures because they're no longer failing, they are the ones that are letting go of anti-Zionism as a mark of Arab and Muslim identity, and actually refashioning an Arab and Muslim identity that can embrace Jewish sovereignty as Abrahamic, as part of the Arab and Muslim identity, rather than as some kind of mark of shame that needs to be excised. So this is the future. I'm under no illusions. This is still a minority view in the Arab world. The Arab world still tells the story of the Jews as foreigners, right? All the words of white European settler, colonialist, crusader, they're basically synonyms for foreigner. This is still the dominant view in the Arab world. Israel is a mark of a foreign invasion into a land, therefore it needs to be pushed out. But for the first time, even if it's still a minority view, for the first time we have an Arab and Muslim view that looks at the Jewish state and rather than say foreign, actually says Abraham. And that's the path to peace.
So looking at, let's say, the people in Gaza, so a lot of them, as we go along since October 7th, a lot of them have become more radical in their viewpoints against Israel. Is that not true?
No.
No.
Actually, amazingly, and a lot of people say, oh, the war is creating more radicalism, which again, empirically is not true. Look at Nazi Germany, look at Japan. The very creation of war, the fact that you have war does not immediately translate into radicalism. When people say, oh, Hamas is an idea, you cannot defeat an idea. Of course you can. We live the good life that we live today because we've defeated a lot of terrible ideas. And one of the ways to defeat ideas is to actually defeat those who carry the idea in war. Because when people realize that the idea brought them devastation, they are often willing to reconsider it. So actually, Hamas is more popular now in the West Bank, which carries less of the repercussions of the Hamas invasion of October 7th, and less in the Gaza Strip, who are bearing the brunt of Hamas's invasion. So the assumption that the war in itself creates more radicalism is empirically and absolutely not true.
Okay. Destiny, what's your thoughts on this?
One of the feelings that I have is that I think that there are wide cultural differences between how Jewish people view their societies and how Arabs view their societies. I think sometimes I think it's worth taking a look at the differences and how they view them to see what types of solutions are acceptable for those people. A feeling I have, I'm generalizing a lot, but if a Jewish person's house is threatened and you say, hey, listen, I'll pay you twice as much to live in a different house, your family will be safe, everything will be fine, conditions for your life will increase and improve, you'll be good. I think that in a general cultural sense, I think the Jewish person says, yeah, that's a no-brainer. I'll take the money, I'll move to this house, we're good. I think an Arab would say, I'm not leaving my house. This is my home. I'll sit here and fight to the death. I don't care if my living conditions are a million times worse. This is the house of my fathers. I'm not leaving this place. I think that this different view of the world sometimes leads to people misunderstanding, I think sometimes where conflict is coming from or why a particular side is unhappy. I don't think that any amount of economic conditions are going to make it so that Palestinians are happy with the living conditions. I think that when you go back and you look at the sources of a lot of the conflict, I think that Eilat was correct in that, well, the economic conditions aren't really that bad. On the contrary, the Palestinian people, I think, are the second most literate Arab population in the world. The literacy rates are high. UNRWA, for all of their faults, provides solid services and economic support and health support and education. However, I mean, if you look at, in 2023, there was the October 7th terrorist attacks. But like, why? What are major sources of frustration for these things? I think it's when you look at things like the Abraham Accords, which to the Palestinians is, the Israelis have found another way to go around us and try to make peace with other countries without including us in the conversation. The border riots, I think largely cited stuff like that, stuff like the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem. Oh, you're going to make this your official capital. You've already annexed, the east side of it, and you're also not including us in the conversation. You look at the Second Intifada. This came after the failures of Camp David. Oh, you don't have any peace agreements with us. You're not going to do anything. Oh, so we're just going to live here forever. You look at the First Intifada. It was some 20 years after the 67 war. It's like, oh, you're increasing your settlements. You're starting to deport some of us. Like, oh, okay, so you don't. You're just going to ignore us. It feels like a lot of the Palestinian violence comes from, I feel like, what they view as, we're not getting the recognition or the respect as an individual people who ought to have a state, but instead we're being treated as somebody that you can pay off, who maybe you can increase the living conditions a bit, maybe you can make us a bit more secure, but ultimately your goal is to just ignore us while you establish a state that allows you to live with honor and dignity. And while we have to sit, for an hour and a half at a checkpoint in order to go into East Jerusalem. And I understand that I'm presenting very, on one side of the story. There are reasons why both sides do what they do, but I think that is the part of the conflict that I think Israeli people have a harder time looking at, or Jewish people have a harder time looking at, because the fixation sometimes is so much on economic conditions. And it's like, well, I don't understand how you can attack. You're living a better life than anybody, in Syria, and than anybody in Yemen, than most people in Egypt. But I think that when Palestinians look at their living conditions, they go, well, those people, at the very least have countries or countries that they can even fight and die for. And we're sitting here as a subjugated, occupied people who, don't even have a country that we can call our own.
Okay, so two questions based on that. Number one, I mean, you paint it as a largely cultural issue. Would you say it's a religious issue, Jews versus Muslims? Also, what would they be happy with? What do they want?
I say largely cultural issue. I mean, there are other aspects at play, of course, as well. Palestinians are a very convenient scapegoat for anybody that does dislike Israel. That's undeniable. I think that's been the case historically. I think it's the case today. In terms of how much does religion play into it, I think that it's always, especially with these populations, I think it's always boiling under the surface a little bit. I think that to look at it as a primary driver of conflict, I don't think is true at all. In my reading of history, I think it's very funny. I think there's this huge myth of Arab unity, and there's this myth of Islamic unity that both the Arabs and the Jews seem to believe in. And I think that if you look at the early wars, you've got your huge figures. Even Nasser was upset at with the Baghdad Pact in Iraq, and even when you look at the strongest nations that were willing to fight against Israel, go figure, it was the bordering nations. It wasn't all the Arab states. It wasn't all the Muslim states. It was the ones that geographically were literally bordering Israel. It was Syria, Jordan, and in Egypt. You got Hamas, which will call for, we want global jihad, global jihad, global jihad. Where's their global jihad? Where's the global jihadist? Nobody's coming to help them in the Muslim world, So I mean, religion is always going to be boiling under the surface. It'd be naive to say that it's not. I mean, especially you look at Hamas. This is an Islamist regime that is, again, calling for global jihad, but they don't get that religious support that you'd expect if there was as much unity among either Arabs or Muslims as they say there is. In terms of what does the final solution look like? I always use that term. So I'm going, what does the final agreement look like? Man, I don't know. I wish I could tell you. Like I said, I just spent 2 weeks talking to a whole bunch of people on the Palestinian and the Israeli side, and I don't think it's I don't think that it's like a little agreement where every single detail is worked out and you've got everything figured out. I mean, Yeah, I think that was tried with the Geneva
rather
Initiative.
than
I think it was tried with Annapolis. I think that Olmert tried it. It has to be like a change in ethos on both sides. It's got to be like a recognition of like Palestinians are probably due some right of like dignity and respect. And then there has to be a changing of the conditions so that they feel they have that. And then from there, you go on to kind of craft what your two states look like, I feel.
So rather than actually what is the solution, but what do you think the Palestinians are looking for? Because you said they're looking for very different things than maybe the West thinks they're looking for, rather than just economics. You said it might be other things.
I feel like on a broad level, it's some like restoration of honor and dignity. But I mean, like that's a very vague. Like, what does that actually look like? I don't know. I think that changes through time, and I think that it depends on who you feel you're negotiating against on both sides. But yeah, I would say that broadly. We can get more detailed if you want, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to give more that'll be amazing.
Well, I mean, like it's like the land. It's probably going to have to be somewhere around 100% land, just because of what was offered before. Like 90% of the West Bank, or it's probably going to have to be some kind of like 98, 99, 100% of the former territory. Obviously, with land swaps to probably preserve, large settlement banks near the Green Line. It's going to have to be some sort of negotiation on holy sites. I feel like every Palestinian I talked to said that the entire Al-Aqsa Mosque compound was a red line. That can't be the case. I feel like they would negotiate more on that, hopefully, if other things were on the table more solidly, if there was a strong negotiator there. It's going to have to be, as much as Israelis hate it, probably some sort of at least not spiritual recognition, some kind of recognition of a right of return. That doesn't mean like all of you are coming back or whatever, but it's got to be some kind of recognition of like, okay, yeah, a lot of you were expelled. We're going to let 50,000 people back, or we're going to let 10,000 a year back, for the next 5 or 10 years or something like that, with some kind of like permanent agreement. Like, okay, well, this is it, right? Now, if people want to immigrate, then fine, but you can't have 5 or 6 million people, or whatever UNRWA says the current refugee count is coming back to the country. But yeah, basically something along the lines of all the prior negotiations.
Einat, what do you think?
So these are exactly all the things that were offered in 2000, offered in 2008. And not only have Palestinians walked away from that to no internal debate and no dissenting voices, they followed it up with massive violence. So one of the things that I am determined not to do, I invented a word for that in the book, which I called West-plaining. West-plaining is when Western diplomats, journalists explain away what Palestinians inconveniently said. And I have become very careful in listening to what they say. And they are very clear that their top priority continues to be no Jewish state. Sometimes, if you don't ask specific questions, they'll just say things like justice or rights. And most people will not understand that justice in the Palestinian telling of it is the undoing, in their view, of the injustice that is the state of Israel. Rights is always the right of return, which again is not a right. It was only created in the Palestinian mindset as a way to continue the war against the Jewish state, because they could not accept that it actually came into being. So a lot of what was described was actually a classic reversal of cause and effect. The violence of, again, the murderous rampage misnamed the Second Intifada happened not because they were not listened. It happened because they did not want a state. It was more important for them, for the Jews, not to have a state. Why do Palestinians don't have a state? At the end of the day, you have to look at the last century and see that, to their credit, they have been consistent and clear every time that they could have had a state for themselves. But the price of that was that the Jews will also have a state. They have always chosen to walk away and follow it up with murderous violence. The Jews have always agreed to a two-state solution as long as one of the two states is Jewish. The original one, the Jews agreed to the creation of Transjordan, the Peel Commission, partition. After 67 proposed it, 2000, 2008. The Jews have always agreed because, as Bevan correctly noted, for the Jews, the key priority was to establish sovereignty. Smaller, bigger, more important is to be sovereign. Now, where Destiny really hits the point is where he said restoration of honor, because here we get to the core. Because a lot of people, when I go through the history, I show that the Palestinians have been clear for a century, no Jewish state, they ask often a very simple follow-up question. But why? Why this complete and utter determination for no Jewish state? Why repeatedly walk away from opportunities to have dignity, statehood, sovereignty in a state of their own just because the Jews are also going to have a state? And the top reason, and that goes a bit also to what you talked about religion, is for the previous 1400 years, before the emergence of Zionism as a political movement, not just a connection with the land of Israel, but as a political movement, the Arab and Muslim conquerors had only ever known one kind of Jew: meek, dispossessed, stateless. Now, there were many elements, but my two favorite that marked out the Jews as being of lower status of Arabs and Muslims. They were not infidels, they were not pagans, so you didn't have to forcefully convert them. Sometimes I joke that they got the first book right, but not the sequels. So they were like still the people of the book, but they were clearly not the equals of Muslims and Arabs. So they had this position, dhimmi, which set them as being of lower status. Two things mark them as lower status, among many others, but my two favorite is that Jews in Arab and Muslim lands could not ride horses. Horses were a mark of dignity. They could only ride donkeys. And they certainly could not bear arms because their defense was the prerogative of the Arab and Muslim ruler. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but it was clearly the prerogative of the Arab and Muslim ruler. Now, when you look at early images of the Zionist Jews in the early 20th century, two things stand out immediately. They're riding horses and they're carrying arms. Imagine the civilizational shock. It's beyond just religion. It's a whole civilization that rested on the knowledge that Jews were of a lower status. Imagine the civilizational shock of seeing in the midst of the Arab and Muslim world, Jews who are defending themselves, carrying arms. They are basically Jews who moved from here and are telling the Arabs and Muslims, we are your equals, as individuals and as a collective. And unfortunately still, for the majority of the Arabs and Muslims, happily not everyone, but the majority, the restoration of dignity and honor is to put the Jews back in their place, not to be sovereign, to be at an inferior status. That is the restoration of honor and dignity. Sometimes when people talk about the Nakba today, I always bring the quote of the Arab Christian intellectual Constantine Zurek, who coined in 48 the term Nakba to refer to what was happening. And it was not some sad tale of dispossession. He describes the Nakba in those words. The catastrophe is 7 Arab armies, so not just the ones adjacent to Jewish sovereignty, 7 Arab armies attempted to subdue Zionism. The words are important. Subdue Zionism, meaning literally put the Jews back as non-sovereign in their place, subdued, attempted to subdue Zionism and returned on their heels impotent. That word is important too, because it conveys the sense of shame of having failed to defeat and subdue the Jews who dared imagine themselves the equals of Arabs and Muslims. So indeed, yes, what Palestinians want is the restoration of dignity and honor. It's just that in their mind, civilizationally, dignity and honor require subduing Jewish sovereignty.
So Destiny, of course, Einat said very different things to what you said, saying that what they want in restoration is to make sure there is no Jewish state. You said, when I think mainly based off what you're speaking to, the people you're speaking to in the past 2 weeks, is that they want to be respected. Are you talking to the people in Gaza, or shouldn't you look at the people who are running Gaza rather than just the people who are there? Because the people who are running Gaza, Hamas, have very different viewpoints.
Yeah, I mean, it's both. Also, I don't actually think I disagree with a single thing that Einat said. I'm just stressing that you have to keep in mind the conditions for both people. Everything that Annette said is true. It's I mean, I can say it's funny for me as an American because I'm not there. It's tragic when you look at the two people, but it's so impossible. It's so impossible that Jews can survive in the Middle East that even the telling of some of the wars is fantastical. In '67, the only reason why Israel was able to win on the first day was because British and American planes were secretly flying missions with them. This was the message that Nasser delivered to the world. It was impossible that an Israeli state could have won that war on their own. Or in '48, the Brits had armed. They had left all sorts of tanks behind, all sorts of weapons behind. For the Haganah, the Yishuv, to fight off the Arabs, because there's no way that they could have managed to. They smuggled in arms from Czechoslovakia. The early days of the war, before the '48 War of Independence, even in the Civil War, actually looked really rough for for the early pre-state, for the Jewish people. So even like when you look at the actual conflicts themselves, the telling has to change a little bit, because it's impossible, it's inconceivable that a Jewish state could exist there, and that the Jewish people, who largely up to that point were seen as kind of like the rejects of Europe. They were bankers, they were finance people, they were whatever. Those people existing and thriving, in the Middle East was just an inconceivable thing. So I 100% agree with Einat's telling there. I'm just saying that if we keep that in mind, and then you move forward through time, and you're trying to work out some sort of actual, peace agreement, or some sort of final arrangement where both sides are happy, that type of like honor and integrity thing has to be kept in mind, because just economic conditions aren't going to make you happy living near a group of people that were relegated to dhimmi status, that weren't even allowed to ride horses. So yeah, I don't agree with anything she's saying, or I don't disagree with anything she's saying. I just think that both sides should know this. There's absolutely no shortage of events to draw from if you want to have an excuse to continue war indefinitely in that region. There are good reasons for both groups of people to have hugely negative opinions about each other, and yeah, I think that you can get lost down a hole very quickly, picking and choosing events to say, well, this is actually why we're going to fight forever. Yeah.
So in terms of actually going forward and actually say, listen, we want to create an environment in which it's good to start looking at going forward to create some sort of long-term arrangement. Destiny and you, Einat, also said that that one of the best things to do is actually encourage people that are being much more pro-Israel and being much more friendly towards Israel, and discouraging the other, and discouraging the thoughts and the ideology of people being that are not as pro-Israel or being anti-Israel. Is that a realistic goal, or how can we
realistic?
Really get
I don't know at this point. I think the most important thing is having.
Yeah, I'm saying, how can we go forward realistically if that's not so realistic?
I mean, the entire international community needs to fuck off from having any opinion or say or talk about anything having to do here. One of the big issues with the international community is, especially because of a lack of understanding of I would say of history, but even of contemporary situations. One thing that I think is very poisonous for Palestinians is when you have an international community that is telling you that you're being genocided, that you're being apartheid, that you have to live in a concentration camp, that you're being ethnically cleansed. What it's doing, I think, on that side is it's driving the expectations of some sort of final agreement up to unrealistic heights. And it's driving you to, like, why? I'm not going to negotiate with somebody who's genociding me. That's insane. Would you have told the Jews in Warsaw that they need to negotiate with Hitler? Or, would you have told, the slaves that they needed to negotiate with their slave masters? No, of course, they rise up and fight. When you have people in the international community that are constantly driving with the most insane possible words they can use to describe a situation, they're driving the Palestinians to think that, like, okay, well, we don't have to negotiate anything, because why would we try to reach some kind of agreement? At some point, the international community is going to save us. The ICC is going to, ship Netanyahu off to The Hague. The ICJ is going to, slap Israel on the wrist and call them genociders. Everybody's going to abandon their cause. Somebody's going to come and invade Israel. The Houthis are going to, destroy enough ships to pressure. Like, it's always I feel like it's very disempowering that all the agencies being removed from the Palestinians to feel any pressure to move towards any final arrangement, because the international community has so much lip service to pay to all of, like, the most charged words they can use to criticize Israel's action. So I would say on one end, I would say the international community is not being very helpful for this. And then, I mean, domestically, I mean, it's a whole other thing. Yeah, sorry, wherever, yeah.
I mean,
But
do you
yeah,
not?
I would start there. I'd say the international community needs to change the way that they approach this, because it's not very solution oriented. It's just like lip service oriented, and I think
So
it's actually setting the region back.
how would you want America to respond then?
How do I want America to respond? I think that Biden is doing a decent job, about as good as you can be. The problem is that, like we're in an election year, and obviously the president only has so much wiggle room, and obviously we don't have like a direct control over Israeli politics, although obviously a lot of influence is exerted. But I don't know if we've had a president since Carter that has like had a good vision and had a strong. I think Bill Clinton actually tried. I think the Clinton parameters were pretty good. I don't know if we have that commitment right now in the White House to have that vision for the Middle East to solve that problem. I'm not sure if it's there at the moment. So I would rather the U.S. like take a step back and just kind of be like helpful towards both sides, rather than to try to take a super active role if there's not like a strong understanding and vision there for what the region should look like in the future.
Okay, so you're saying really to create the right environment to create peace is one is getting the international community to step back, which once again I think is unrealistic. And number two, I mean, realistically talking about that, if a country actually thinks what Israel is doing is genocidal, there is no reason they'll be quiet if they actually believe that. So that's I think that's almost unrealistic. And number two,
that's true, but it's like that's just because the words have been like so meaninglessly used that it doesn't. I get it. Yeah, that's a whole. It's a whole thing.
Yeah, and then number two, you said is is to actually empower the moderate voices and push down the other ideology. Which, once again, I'm not sure exactly how you'd be able to do that properly. You can empower the moderate voices. I'm not sure you can push down the Hamas ideology and the one-state solution ideology.
You have to stop attacking. As much as you don't like it, you have to stop attacking. Your people like Mahmoud Abbas. You can't call him a terrorist. Like again, he's not the best guy in the world, but this is a guy that shows up to meetings in a suit. This is a guy that largely, I'm not aware of him like calling for violence. This is not your Arafat. This is not your, shows up to the Oslo Accords in his fucking military uniform to sign documents, on the world stage. He's a huge improvement. And I think Israel needs to see him as a partner that they're willing to work with in a really positive way. Even if it sucks sometimes. Like, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of reasons to not like a lot of the stuff going on the Palestinian side, but you don't make peace with friends, you make peace with enemies. Like, yeah, finding ways to empower and work with those people to show the Palestinians that their leadership can be trusted and is strong, and to show that you're willing to make compromises and work with them. I think that's important. But the finer details there obviously have to be worked out.
Yeah. Einat, what do you think?
So actually, what I've come to realize if you study history, you actually make peace with defeated enemies, or you make peace with exhausted enemies. You make peace with enemies for whom the war is over. We often think of peace and ending war as the same thing, but they're typically not. You first end the war, and then once it's clear that the war is over, then you begin the negotiations for peace. And this is the step we're missing. It's kind of a big one. The war first has to be over, and the war is the Arab-Palestinian war waged for a century against Jewish self-determination. That war has to be over. Once that war is over, I completely agree with Destiny. The details will be the details of the Clinton parameters or not. But even someone like Abu Mazen, which perhaps himself personally wanted to make an agreement, when he was presented with the opportunity to finally have a state, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, holy sites, he walked away and told Condoleezza Rice, I cannot tell 4 million refugees, they're not refugees by any international standard, but they think they are, that they're not returning. Again, there's no return. But he understood that he doesn't have the people, that the ethos of his people is one of the complete negation of the Jewish state. And therefore, if we do not address the core ideology, we will only ever have leaders who are limited by their people's ideology. I mean, leaders can work at the margins, at the envelope, but they can't just completely break with their people. So the people have to become different. And in here, I completely agree with Destiny. And this is the tragedy of the Palestinian people. We talked about ending ideologies and that often destruction and defeat are actually the path to changing. The book I've been reading and been inspired by on Japan is called Embracing Defeat. The Japanese were able to move in a different direction by embracing what is a clear defeat and surrender. So in order to move in that direction, we even need to accept that. And I agree that the international community, and this is the tragedy, has been doing the opposite. Because every time that the Palestinians had a moment of despair and destruction, where, let's say, they lost the war of 48, where they attempted to subdue Zionism, failed to do so. The Jewish state was able to survive the Arab onslaught, declare independence. This was a moment when the Arabs could have said, you know what? Having spent the last previous 30 years trying to prevent a Jewish state, closing the embryonic Jewish state's gates to Jewish immigration at the most critical moment in history, really waging this war against Jewish self-determination has been actually a waste of our time. And we're now going to develop a vision of living next to a Jewish state rather than instead of it. But rather than, whenever Palestinians could have had this moment, and this is why I'm focusing so much also on the present, because we might arrive again at such a moment, but the tragedy of this moment again is that Palestinians face the repercussion and devastation of their choice to invade Israel. And really, what happened on October 7th was not some terrorism. It was a proper and brutal Game of Thrones invasion. Then when they could say, you know what? This ideology of revenge, return, no Jewish state has brought nothing but devastation. How about we pursue the path of living next to a Jewish state rather than instead of it? Whenever Palestinians could have said that, and now they are always so useful, like Destiny noted, as the cover for the scapegoating of Jews, that they always had someone kind of rushing into the breach of their previous defeated sponsors to say, no, change nothing. You are pure victims of pure evil. This is exactly those words. I've written a lot about this placard strategy. It's not a coincidence. You can go back, see it as a Tsarist Russian Soviet strategy of inserting into the global bloodstream through international organizations this nursery rhyme repetition of Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil. The word genocide, apartheid, racism, colonialism, they're all chosen. They're not new. They're all chosen because they are agreed to be evil. And essentially the message all the time is Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil. And indeed, Palestinians see that. I have a colleague, Dr. Shani Moore, wrote a brilliant piece after October 7th called Ecstasy and Amnesia. He talked about the ecstasy of Arabs and Palestinians as they go to war against the Jewish state, always speaking of annihilation. And then when they fail, amnesia sets in. And then they are victims of pure evil and have no consequences for their actions. So yes, one of the things I'm most passionate about is the idea that Palestinians have agency. They have the possibility of choosing to live next to a Jewish state rather than instead of it. But in order for them to exercise agency, it would be wonderful if so many outside forces would stop kind of injecting into the Palestinian receptacle every anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish ideology that they need for their own survival. And by the way, they never survive anyway.
So this solution that you're saying, which is actually, well, not solution, but forward, some path towards that, which is actually finishing the war, then to start actually just try to treat the moderate voices better, or on those lines. What do you mean by finish the war? And I'm going to ask you the same question as well. Overall, what you're saying as well is to treat certain people, the moderate voices, better and push down the other ideology. Is that realistic?
I'll start from your realistic question, since you constantly repeat it. The this is not a matter of realism or not. This is what the conflict is about. The conflict is between the Jews wanting a state and the Arabs wanting the Jews not to have a state. And because this happens to be the Jewish state rather than like a blue people or a green people, those who are fighting the Jewish state are able to get the support of every anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic power in history. So this is the conflict. To end it, one of two things need to happen. Either there's no Jewish state. This is what the effort has been going into for the last century, by wars, terrorism, boycotts, international condemnations. And the word Westplaining, sometimes journalists, diplomats tell me, the Palestinians know that the Jewish state is here to stay. Those are delusions, blah, blah. And I'm like, they're not the irrational side in this conflict. They see 7 million Jews surrounded by 500 million Arabs, nearly 2 billion Muslims, mostly still devoted to their non-existence, and they not irrationally conclude that another generation, another 5 generations, this Jewish state, like the Crusader state in their mind, will go away. This is why Yahya Sinwar now feels that he's Salah ad-Din, the Arab leader who will bring about, the Muslim leader who will bring about the end of this foreign implant, Crusader State 2.0. So this is the conflict. So the only way that the conflict ends is either there's no Jewish state, or if you happen to think that it is important and valuable for Jews to be sovereign in their homeland. And in parentheses, there's no more terrible libel than the notion that Jews are happy to move and the Arabs are connected to the land. Empirically, by the way, it's not true. But again, this is the Arab way of kind of positing the Jews as foreigners. They will move easily. We are going to stick to our land. I mean, empirically not true. But again, it's part of the libel to show that the Jews are foreigners in the land. They don't belong here. It's not their ancestral homeland. This ancient connection that they claim to have is invented. I heard that from Palestinians. So this one way that the conflict ends is that there's no Jewish state. But for those who actually think it matters that the Jews will be sovereign, then the other way that the conflict ends is that the Arabs finally forgo, as Bevan said, their top priority of opposing a Jewish state in any part of the land to the last. When they finally develop a constructive vision of living next to a Jewish state rather than instead of it. This is possible. There's nothing in the Arab or Muslim mindset, and that also, Destiny was correct. There are Arab Israelis. We see the people in the Gulf. You can have an Arab and Muslim identity that supports Jewish self-determination. You can have an Arab and Islamic interpretation of history and text that supports the Jewish right to self-determination. There's nothing that makes it impossible. So for me, I don't discuss if it's realistic or not. I'm saying this is the only way that it ends, and therefore we need to work towards that goal and thereby make it realistic.
Okay, and then what about the other point, which is about the war? What do you see as finishing the war?
The war, and again, the war is not Gaza. Gaza is merely an arena in the century-long war against Jewish self-determination. So the war ends when a substantial share of Palestinians, and you'll see it all through society, leaders, columnists, groups, people will say, we have ended our century-long war with Zionism. We want to live next to the Jewish state. We recognize that the Jews have a history here. They have a legitimate claim. We understand that we're no longer refugees and we have no right of return into the sovereign state of Israel. This is how the century-long war against Zionism ends. That's what it looks like.
Destiny, would you agree that one of the biggest issues is that many Arabs don't recognize that Jewish people can have a state?
I think it's kind of an issue. I think something that's been demonstrated in the region is that people will have an idea, but you can have like these historic leaders that can come out and do things that will move the needle significantly. I think that the entire world, the entire Arab world, and Jews probably felt like peace with any Arab country was impossible. And you had Anwar Sadat, who made strong enough overtures towards it. You had the commitment from the United States, from Carter, that not only did peace eventually happen, it happened with Israel sacrificing a great deal of land and destroying and moving, some 5,000 settlers out of the Sinai to do it. After it happened, I think people were largely happy with it. I think that populations can have a certain view of something that can be largely negative, but I think that if you have leaders that are willing to come together and put something positive out there, as long as an agreement is there, as long as people have something to rally behind, I think that public opinion can shift quite quickly. So I wouldn't say all this to say that, well, opinion on the ground doesn't matter. Obviously, you're going to have your political restrictions, especially in a democratic society. You can only maneuver so much based on what your coalition is willing to support in Israel. And for leaders in non-democratic societies, you can only maneuver as much as, you're not going to get cooed or shot in the back of the head by, people that are working with you. But yeah, I would say that the opinions of people on the ground aren't like hard limits on what are achievable. They kind of give you like the final contours of what's possible, I would say.
So do you not think that do you think a lot of Arabs have that ideology, and do you not think it's limiting a lot of what's happening?
In terms of recognizing a Jewish state, I think that if the Palestinian problem was solved, I think that you would have a chance to see the opinions of people move. Israel has made peace with a lot of Arab leaders. The Arab populations haven't necessarily followed suit yet, but I think that the agreements are honored. I think it says something that, when the Muslim Brotherhood in like 2011, took over in Egypt, they honored their peace agreement with Israel. That was surprising. I think it says something that when Muslims attacked Israel, when Iran shot a bunch of missiles at Israel, it was other Muslims, Saudis and Palestinians from Jordan. Jordan is like 2/3 Palestinian, helped to intercept those missiles. I think those are meaningful things. Even if the entire population hasn't become, pro-Jew or, massive supporters of Israel, I think the opinion can be slowly moved over time. But as long as the Palestinian issue is open, I don't think there's going to be much chance for progress in that domain. It's like trying to heal a wound when you've got the knife still stuck in. I think that once that issue gets solved, and then you can start to see, hopefully, the opinions of the people change as time goes on. But I mean, I'm not going to try to predict the future there.
Einat, what do you think?
I think we're stuck in exactly the opposite situation. There is no way to resolve the Palestinian issue as long as the Palestinian identity, encompassing all Palestinians, again, except for a few that I've met, is a complete negation of the Jewish state. Now, Destiny compares it to Egypt, and Egypt is an interesting case. Someone actually recently said, basically most or all the Arab countries want the Jewish state gone, but for them it's a second, third, or fourth priority. So here and there you can reach some arrangements. And actually what we have with Egypt is an example of what it looks like when it's their second priority, because we call what we have with Egypt peace, and Destiny was correct that we need to be careful about this word. We call what we have with Egypt peace, but let's examine it. Israel gave the entirety of the Sinai Peninsula, celebrated a peace agreement, and then what do we have? It's a good non-mutual attack agreement that definitely holds. The defense part of it largely holds. We can talk about Egypt's double game as using Gaza, a bit like China uses North Korea, kind of. It creates trouble for Israel through Gaza by maintaining deniability, but that's part of their double game. But this peace, we have barely diplomatic relations, no cultural relations, no real serious broad economic relations, no cultural relations, no tourism. Egypt continuing the Nazi insertion of their ideology in Arabic language through the Arabic radio. Egypt continues that today. It is the number one producer and promoter of the vilest anti-Semitic content, really der Stürmer type, in Arabic language. Egypt is the number one or a prominent promoter of anti-Israel resolutions in international bodies. And we agree to call this peace. Queen Rania goes around the world saying the most libelous things about Israel, and we claim that this is peace. So And this is with countries that, as someone said, their second or third priority is to see the Jewish state gone. But for the Palestinians, the difference from Egypt is that this is their entire identity. This is why you could never have a leader that emerges from them who will break with it as long as this is their identity, that their identity is based on the negation of Jewish sovereignty. We can't just wish it away. So I think where we differ, Destiny and I, is over our theory of change. I think we both believe in the possibility of change. We don't think that things are immutable. I think we both believe that ultimately once change happens, what an agreement can look like, what are the broad parameters. But my theory of change has definitely changed after going through multiple efforts to make peace, seeing what happened to them, seeing what happened to other peace efforts, and ultimately taking care to listen to the Palestinians and actually taking them seriously rather than thinking that we can paper over that. So I think we can get to that, but we will not get to it if we not address the core Palestinian ideology that negates a Jewish state in any part of the land.
Okay. So Destiny, just the last question. You keep saying how the Palestinians are starting to get on better with Israel. Whether you're talking about when Iran attacked Israel, and Jordan and other countries also stood up and protected Israel, or that the Palestinians after October 7th didn't follow suit. The rest of the Palestinians didn't follow suit. Why did October 7th happen? If they become so much more better educated and
October 7th was, I think October 7th was organized by Hamas. I think it had a ton of support from Iran. I think Iran, wants to fight against the entire, I think their perception of like that Saudi axis of which Israel is included. And there are two big insertion points into, I guess, the Gulf and the Near East are Yemen via the Houthis, and then I guess really Hezbollah and Hamas, in Israel and Lebanon. So, when I look at why October 7th happened, I'm thinking there's a lot of Iranian foreign influence there. In terms of conditions on the ground, Gaza, since Hamas has taken over, has probably been like the focal point of Palestinian resistance towards Israeli ruler occupation, however you want to call it, define that, I don't care. The fact that the can keeps getting kicked down the road for what any sort of actual agreement looks like between the entire Arab world, including Palestinians and Israel, I think is probably continues to drive that discontent. And there's going to be more and more and more attacks every time Israel tries to make peace with another country without involving the Palestinians. The most recent round of this were the Abraham Accords. I think you're probably going to continue to see more violence and more attacks from a frustrated people, especially one that has like a radical terrorist administrator to their region. So, yeah, I would say that I feel like October 7th happened because you've got the right foreign intervention for it. You've got the support from people like Iran, and you've got the right domestic conditions for it. You've got Israel continuing to ignore, I guess, the Palestinian people to make any final conditions for peace. And then you've got a region that Hamas is allowed to administer on their own. That just seems like a boiling pot that is always going to boil over. I say that's not even, it happened. What is this technically? Like the 6th or 7th Israeli Hamas war? It was like 2021, you had 2018, you had the border riots, you had 2014 Protective Edge, you had 2012, you had 2008 Cast Lead. It's happened over and over and over and over and over again. I feel like it's kind of, again, it's tragic, but it's kind of funny to be like, how did this happen? It's like, it's like the 7th time, it keeps happening. Yeah. Obviously this is the worst one, but yeah.
Well, thank you both for joining. Thanks, Destiny. Thanks, Einat.